year on year about 100,000 children and young people needing a home outside of their biological family. There's just not enough foster care within the United Kingdom. And so Home for Good looks to the church and says there's 50,000 churches in the United Kingdom. That means that even if one person, couple or family in every church in this country said, look, would you, the church, support me if I opened up my home? Well, then we would be the solution to the tune of a half of caring for all those young people. And then obviously if that happened twice within every church, we would eradicate the need for the care system. And that to me, Si, feels like eminently possible.
Welcome, everybody. This is Simon Gilbo with Inspired. Inspired, if you're new to us, is all about meeting mates of mine from all sorts of different walks of life, some very high profile, some totally behind the scenes, but all of them with a common denominator that they've seen God at work in their lives. They've been through some sucker punches. They're willing to share in a really honest, nitty-gritty way. And, you know, we're bombarded by so much bad news, aren't we? Relentless from the media. And we just need to hear good news. And we need to be stirred in our faith. That's the point of Inspired. I have no doubt that in about 50 minutes' time, having listened to our guests, that you will leave excited and envisioned and stirred for your own journey with Jesus. All right, that's what we're shooting for. And this week, I'm really thrilled to have with us Tarn Bright. Welcome, Tarn.
Hello.
So great to have you. So Tanya, who is Tarn to a friend, we go back about 15 years, I think it was. We met at St. John's Ealing. You were doing some youth stuff. I think that was where we first met. Yeah. I'd always heard about you through your sister, because I was at university. I was at Loughborough University with her sister Ness, who's now married to Rich, and they're doing fantastic stuff. And we'll get them on a different podcast sometimes. Then you're also very involved in Spring Harvest. I think we've overlapped there. And last time I saw you, Tarn, was at the Big Church Festival. I think you were just recovering from surgery. You didn't look in a great way. Has it been a rough few months?
I'd actually had a hysterectomy, which happens to us women about this age of 50.
Right.
And it was a bit of a shocker, but we got through it.
Yeah. Oh, well done. But right, before launching you off, Tarn is CEO of Home for Good. And the aim of Home for Good is to find a home for every child who needs one throughout the UK, be it through fostering, adoption, whichever channel. She has herself adopted Mac and Charlie. She's doing that as a single mum. She's a complete legend, and I'm really excited to hear her story. So, Tarn, let's just kick off. I don't know much about your background. Let's go back as far as you like. Tell us about your childhood, teenage years. What were they like?
Well, yeah, that's interesting, because obviously you've just referenced Ness and Rich. And so oftentimes, Simon, when people either make the connection or somebody tells them that we're sisters, there's almost a disbelief, because there's just not a natural, obvious sort of, of course, that makes sense, because we neither look like each other nor sound like each other. And our upbringings, even though we were brought up in the same nuclear biological family, we experienced life very different to each other. And so my lived experience in my family was one where I largely felt frustrated, angry, and bored. Mm-hmm. And that sounds really harsh, because my parents were beautiful people. They came to faith when they got married in their mid-20s. They tried to do life as best they could. They were in a sort of a postmodern expression of marriage, which meant that mum was this hugely creative type who was singing and dancing on the showboats in Australia, and then was sort of ushered back home to marry dad, who she had met some months before at a working men's club in Rochester. And so mum really, in one sense, sort of had to succumb to the marriage of the day, as it were. And dad went out to work and she stayed at home. And it probably, in today's world side, they would have done it the other way round. And mum would have stayed the creative, expressive extrovert, and dad would have probably flourished being at home. But it meant that then when my sister and I were born and were raised, we were in an environment where really we had a bored mum at home, and a dad who was stressed to the eyeballs. And he had a heart attack on the motorway on the M40 going into work one day, only aged 45. And really that then meant that Dad never really re-entered the workforce again in quite the same way, of which, my gosh, Si, I don't know about you, love, I'm now 50 and I can't imagine A, having a heart attack, and B, it then having an impact on how and when I worked really from this point on. And so it meant that by the time I got to 16, I was really in this sort of middle class, dare I say it, slightly sort of nominal in terms of faith environment, and an older sister who I think it would be a really fair analysis to say we just didn't get on. We didn't have a connection point. There wasn't a appreciation of who each other was. And so I left home really just out of nothing other than sort of desperation to experience something. And as you can imagine, Si, for a relatively unhinged 16-year-old with not a lot of self-worth or identity, and quite a complex view of faith, quite a misunderstanding, if we can call it that, of who God might be for me, just meant that I entered into the world of chaos and mayhem and really brought anyone else along with me into that. I think it was a sheer relief, Si, sheer relief for Mum and Dad and my sister that I exited, and I can totally appreciate and understand why that would have felt like a relief that I had gone from the family home. But I, sadly, Si, then entered into a whole world of drugs and alcohol and sex, and really becoming something of much less than, as we know, Father God, the beautiful Father God, would want for me. But there I found myself for a few years, unable to express who I was as a person, and getting more and more lost in trying to find hedonistic ways to feel myself. And that ultimately was all I was trying to do, is to feel God and to feel myself within that, but found a multitude of really destructive ways to do it through. So that was teenage years.
And did it take getting to the bottom of the barrel then?
Yes, in as much as that I probably couldn't have got far more to the bottom. Constantly, sort of every day, hungover, a different person in the bed, waking up and sort of exiting rooms and places and spaces, trying to sort of hold down a job of some sort. But by aged 18, I don't know how. Well, I do know how. I'd lied on my CV, and I had walked into a temping agency and told them that I did actually have a qualification. And then when in the agency, I'll never forget it, they said, well, you need to do a typing test. And I sort of blagged my way through. Yes, of course. And they said, well, we'll need you to do sort of a test to show us how many words per minute, because if we're going to get you a temping job as a secretary, then we need to know how you can type. Well, it just so happened that the lady went out for lunch. And so with two very fast fingers, I rapidly made my way through a typing test, but I got the number of words that I needed, but of course without her seeing, in fact, that it was just two very fast fingers. And she placed me into a large multinational company as a temp. And A, I couldn't quite believe that I had managed to get a temping job, and B, because up to that point I'd just really sort of been in pubs and clubs and all sorts of things. And I found myself in a very professional environment, very professional, with people who had aspiration and who articulated themselves and who were going somewhere and who had a certain sort of energy and hunger about them. Now, I found this very appealing, because the last few years prior to that for me had been really quite sordid. I think it's probably the best way I can describe it. And people with very little aspiration. And I ended up working really hard and figuring out that actually I could learn quite quickly. Because at school, now in my later life, I was diagnosed with ADHD only but a few years ago. And the difference I found when in the workplace was when I could learn at my pace and speed, and I was learning stuff I wanted to learn and I was interested in, that wasn't about learning things by rote and then having to regurgitate information to do some pointless test on some language I never thought I would ever use again, Latin or otherwise. And suddenly I'm in an environment whereby I'm learning things about commercial integrity, and I'm learning about supply chain logistics, where I finally understood that if you buy somewhere in this country and you have to get it to the UK, there's a whole long process by which you have to do it well in order that it arrives on the same date. I found it fascinating. And so I worked really, really hard, and I just became a learner. And I'd never enjoyed learning before. And within a matter of a few years, I'd become one of the youngest departmental directors of a large department within this large multinational. And then from where I just kept getting promoted. From there, I then went into international procurement. And from that, I went into international contract negotiation. And by my mid-20s, I was traveling the world on business class flights. Wow. Honestly, still can't believe it to this day, really. So honestly, it's one of those things I look back and I think, my goodness.
And having ditched the sordid side and just having to up your game, or sort of schizophrenic on that level?
Yeah, partially schizophrenic, in as much as that was not able to shed what I would call a deep sense of self-loathing. Mm-hmm. And so sabotage comes into that. And again, you may sort of think, gosh, she's sounding like she's pulling out some psychological terms here. But I've done a huge amount of work on myself over these many years, and particularly actually the last decade, particularly done more work on understanding myself than at any other point in my life. And so acknowledge that when you feel as though you've done wrong or are carrying shame, which was a very large part of my life for a long, long time, you sabotage things, because it's better to sabotage so it goes wrong than to almost feel as though you're going to try really hard to get it right and it still then fails. And so even within me sabotaging many things, I was still drinking very heavily. I was still in a promiscuous mindset, and yet doing very well in business. And the problem is with then what was international business lifestyle, it's actually very hard to live a life of integrity unless you've got a very clear set of psychological boundaries around you, and or a strong marriage, and or an accountability group. And I didn't have those things because I wasn't in and of faith when I was in business. And so my lifestyle really just accompanied the hedonism that came with, you know, traveling to places, meeting people, having overnight encounters. And I also worked for a large international organization, which was ultimately selling and marketing alcohol. So it was almost rewarded, dare I say. I was one of the few women as well, Si, who were in the international negotiation and contract space. So being one of the few women, I almost had to then develop a masculine
persona,
exterior and persona. So I would drink hard, party hard, and then I would negotiate hard, and was seen as one of the lads. And for somebody with my temperament, in one sense, that was easy-ish for me to do. But my gosh, did there have consequences to my well-being? And I did that for a number of years. And then the moment came where I just knew it was not sustainable. And by that, I mean, I was going through relationships, once every 2-3 months, I'd go through another relationship, both actually my girlfriends as well as sort of romantic relationships, because I just didn't know what it was to be a friend. I didn't know what it was to be a person alongside somebody that carried any worth or integrity, and just got exhausted and realized that there was something about the God that my parents would speak of, and while sadly I didn't experience either in the local church environment that we were in, you know, the majority of churches we went to as a young family, Si, were not particularly focused in one sense on the God that I read about in the Bible, you know, and there was this real disconnect for me, that I would read these incredible stories about, you know, Paul wandering around, stomping on the heads of snakes and, you know, would survive, and shipwrecks, and walking out of jails because he would pray to the living Lord, and walls would shake, and Jesus would heal and travel the land, changing lives and hearts and minds. And then I would look at our local Marlow Bottom existence and it just didn't correlate, right?
I know Marlow Bottom. My sister lives in Marlow. Funny.
So we grew up in, or some years, we spent quite literally, there is a place called Marlow Bottom, and it was the bottom of Marlow. I mean.
American audiences would be like, those Brits are so weird.
It's like the arse of Marlow.
Dear Tom,
when people think of the
raising the tone.
angler,
So anyway, this is the moment. This is the moment when Jesus broke
this
in.
is the moment. Because I just thought, well, where was that God? Where was the God that I read about but didn't experience? And oh my goodness, if I could somehow be connected to that life-giving, radical, revolutionary, if I could somehow meet with that Jesus, then I figure that I will suck it up, and I don't care what humility pill I have to take in order to reconnect with that, even if it feels embarrassing to go back to family, mum, dad and sister, who somehow always seemingly met the God who I wanted to meet but never quite could. So I was engaged to, I think, well, at that point, still my mid-20s, to the third fella, and we bought a house in London, and I just wanted to re-engage with this revolutionary God. Well, actually to see whether he existed, and then to see whether there would even dare be a way that I might connect with him. And I found a church round the corner, and so said to said fella, I'm going out shopping. And shopping was, a sort of a very normal part-time spending money I didn't have on stupid things I didn't want or need. And so would sneak into this church on a Sunday morning. And it just so happened that this local church round the corner from where I lived in London at that point was a black majority Pentecostal church. And the only reason that I really knew it existed was because I used to frequent it when it was a nightclub.
Right.
And this was the irony, right, Si? Because back in the day, then I would go to this club, and it was an Irish club, and it was called Top Hats. And I would roll into this club many times when the pubs would shut, and I would drink and dance and smoke and all sorts of shenanigans. And I realized that this place had been sold and must have been bought by this church, because every Sunday morning I would just hear worship. And so I was partly interested to go into it, to A, see how a nightclub could turn into a church, B, if I just stayed at the back, no one would know anyway. C, might I experience something of that which I wanted to see if even existed? And I walked in, and it probably took 4 or 5 mornings where I would literally sit at the back and cry, and would listen to people worshipping and dancing. And it was, because it was a black majority church, of course, it actually had emotion in it. And it was expressive and scary and full on. And it was very much into not only the gifts of the Spirit, but into, in one sense, experiencing the demonic and working very openly with exorcisms and just removing unclean things from people who just wanted to be set free. And, this was, in one sense, you could say, oh my gosh, of all the churches, Tarn, you could have picked, you went in bold.
Yeah.
I just, I didn't walk into the local URC where we sort of read liturgy every morning. Yeah. But it was what I needed, Si. It was what I needed. And I experienced something of the power of God, and I saw people experiencing God. And probably for my temperament as well, I needed something experiential. I've gone on in later years to really appreciate places like the Northumbria community, whereby there is a sort of a beautiful Celtic groundedness of faith. But that's only in later years, really, that I've been able to embrace and appreciate that, because I know God now. And so that was it. So I gave my life to Christ all those many years ago in a nightclub in which I used to stub cigarettes out on the carpet. And there I was, snotty on the carpet, some many years later, giving my life to Christ and shedding all of that pain and shame and accumulated horror of having lived life outside of the construct of that which God had always intended for me. And it took a while. It wasn't overnight. So I must have made about 20 altar calls, where you go to the front, start all over again. Forgive me, God, I've come back, but I need to come back again. For me, it wasn't a one-hit wonder. And I struggled to shed some of the patterns that I had developed. And It took a while.
But he's patient, isn't he? And he takes us where
So
we're at,
patient.
and he also
So
takes us with our personality. And
Yeah.
I love that. So the energy, boundless, full-on Tarn doesn't have to become demure and
No,
mute, and so
no.
you're just unleashed in a different way, aren't you?
Yeah.
So what did that look like?
Well, that was quite literally it. It was unleashed, and I couldn't quite believe that the same. I thought I would become actually quiet and demure, I suppose, because of, I don't know, I guess what I had seen around me in my earlier years. Faith meant serious. Faith meant you no longer like jokes from like Wicked Willie. And, do you know what I mean? Like, I just made this assumption I would change into grey. And I was just delighted to work out that, A, that's not what God had for me. And also people encouraged me to be fully me. And I really just went from being loud and extrovert for a large FTSE 100 company to being loud and extrovert for God.
Mm.
And so still, A, annoying a whole load of people in that process.
Are you Marmite?
Well, it's funny you should say that, because I ask people that a lot. And I seem to have worked out a way, say, over the years to not be Marmite, but yet also within that, I don't dilute myself, but I'm able to blend myself in a way that means I can deeply listen, I can appreciate other people's personalities, and I can assist and love others in a way that is right for them.
Yeah.
I think that just comes with maturity, doesn't it?
Yeah. Just let me say that. So, sorry for non-UK audiences. Marmite is this thing that you spread on your bread. It's sort of beefy, but it's not beef, is it? But you either love it or you hate it. So anyway, back to the story.
I.e., you either love it or you hate it. The point being about Marmite.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it would be a fair thing to say that when people encounter me, listen, if I don't rock their boat, then that you're not left in too much doubt as to where I'm going to be coming from in life. And that is to be a massively big hugger who loves people, who laughs loudly, and who ultimately God has put in me a force of personality to fight on behalf of others.
Yeah.
And that's what I realized all along, really, is that all of that anger and frustration and energy that I had as a little girl, it just didn't know how to be harnessed toward the right thing.
Mm.
And so once I had a means by which to understand myself, but also to understand that all of that energy could go towards fighting on behalf of others, everything just slotted into place.
Yeah. How long did it take you, though, to find your sweet spot?
Proper sweet spot, I would say 10, 15 years.
Yeah. That's a journey, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And I'm now just turned 50, and I have a 10 and an 11-year-old, adopted boys, full sibling brothers. And I run, as you know, Home for Good, which is a UK Christian charity, finding homes from across the church, which I still believe passionately. The church is the divinely appointed vehicle for shalom and well-being, and to place children with those who love God and who are able to use the power of the church. And by the power, I don't just mean in the obvious way of the power of the Holy Spirit. I mean the power of relationship, of commitment to each other, of deep and profound working together for the greater good of our communities. That's the church, right? Mm. And to have children placed in that community of people who seek to serve each other. Like the way I care for Mac and Charlie, Si, we've got 5 core mentors who journey alongside me with Mac and Charlie. By mentors, I mean families who just will not give up on us.
Yes.
They won't give up, and I won't give up on them and their kids. Mm. And, great big men from construction companies who can still pick Mac and Charlie up one hand each, who love my boys, who help them navigate all the challenges they have, which are many and vast. Yeah. And that's the church. And so in that sense, have I hit my sweet spot now at 50? I probably would say now, as a sadly divorced woman of 2 adopted boys, embraced and planted and rooted in a church now for many years, I am now in my sweet spot. And yet I came to faith at 28, and it's taken that long to meet me in the fullness of who God called me to be. It's taken that amount of time.
Yeah. Hi, folks. I hope 2024 has got off to a good start. I think most of you know this podcast comes out on the auspices of Great Lakes Outreach, working in Burundi, which is still annoyingly the hungriest and poorest country in the world. And there are so many positives. I mean, I look back at the last year, see that we've impacted a couple of 100,000 people in a very meaningful way. I've got all these lovely photos of prostitutes that we've helped get out of prostitution, giving them a new skill as tailors. I think of street kids that we've helped get off the streets. Think of microfinance loans that we've given out to poorest of the poor people, mainly widows who have managed to start up businesses and are now thriving, being lifted out of poverty. Mud huts that have been able to knock down and build sort of brick houses with a tin roof and a door that can be locked to actually protect these vulnerable ladies. So many people have come into a relationship with Jesus, come to faith. I mean, it's absolutely beautiful. In that context, at the same time, there have been 40% food price rises of basic foodstuffs, and there have been 5 hikes in the last 3 months of fuel, which just adds up to crippling inflation that affects everybody. It's so challenging. So if you want to back us, if you're enjoying the podcast, I'd really appreciate it, you sowing into the work. And that's so you can go do that at greatlakesOutreach.org/inspired. We'd love it for you to journey with us. greatlakesOutreach.org/inspired. And keep enjoying the podcast. Now let's get back to it. Well, in terms of just chronology, we've jumped a bit there,
Yeah.
but so we want to hear Mac and Charlie's story. We want to hear a lot more about Home for Good. But can you talk about the divorce? It's holy ground in a sense. I don't want to pry, but it's helpful, isn't it? Because some people think they're castaways. They cannot still serve. They're secondhand goods, whatever. And can you share as little or as much about that journey?
Yeah, I will share some, obviously, in terms of my ex-husband still being adopted dad to Mac and Charlie. It's important that I just honour the story that went on within our family in order that Mac and Charlie don't ever have to negotiate sort of difficult stuff that, they aren't aware of and probably never will be, because it's my ex-husband's and I's story. But probably the headlines are, it was not a happy or a marriage whereby it brought the best out in each other, and situations happened which meant that it just wasn't going to be the right environment to bring up Mac and Charlie in. And that's probably where I leave it whenever I speak publicly. All's to say, I where at all and where I can and where I do support a relationship with Mac and Charlie and their dad, that's exactly what happens. And the way I figure is, sometimes in marriages that don't work, you can be a pants partner to each other, but be an okay parent, and so that's what I navigate at this point in my life. Si is the boys have a relationship with my ex-husband, and for as long as that is something that brings them something that is of quality, then that is what I will absolutely support to happen. But what it does mean in my practical day-to-day is that I am a solo working mum of 2 boys with additional needs, and I work full-time. And I'm deeply immersed, as we've already sort of spoken about, in my local community and church. And that is, oh my days, that is enough to juggle. I'm also, seriously. I serve some amazing other charities as well on their leadership and on their boards. And life is a full and glorious place, but it has stretched to its side where there's some days where I do have to keep continually questioning whether I am doing the right thing and doing it in the right way. But because I have such an accountability group around me, it means that I'm not making decisions on my own. I make decisions in community. Yeah. And so we still feel that, by and large, what I'm doing and how I'm serving and using my time is still God honouring. And Mac and Charlie still get what they need with a highly invested mum, with the community that we're based in, who love and adore them. So it's tough at times, though, when people kind of work out that I'm divorced and, I'm still, I guess, regarded in our sort of language as an evangelical leader, and the whole divorce thing still doesn't go down well in some circles. And I just have to suck that up, Si, and show huge grace in that. No one will ever know the story, and neither do they need to.
Yeah.
People just need, those who know me and love me know that I've journeyed it with as much integrity as is possible.
Yeah.
And it was the right thing for us, in order that myself, Mac and Charlie had a means by which to develop and each reach our potential. And, you know, that's just one of the sad parts of life when it doesn't work well. God draws a bigger circle around us, Si, a bigger circle, right?
Yeah.
And the grace circle gets bigger and the embracing circle gets bigger. And I've just found that those who I do life with, who know me well and know the reality of life, none of them have gone far at all. We have been blessed with the most loyal, significant men and women in our lives. And that to me is as close to what I can see of God as, you know, knowing God himself. It's the people in my life who I next most closely experience God through.
Yeah. I mean, that's so good to hear. So I know because I've heard you talk about Mac and Charlie, you don't expose them, but their story is helpful in terms of giving us the picture of the situation in England. So why don't you just go for that?
Yeah, sure. So Mac and Charlie are two brothers of a clan of about 13 children. And Mac and Charlie are the only two that were successfully placed in what we would call permanence, and by that we mean adoption in the UK. The rest were placed into a variety of different residential units and foster care. We're not sadly in contact with any of their half brothers and sisters, even though it's something that I feel very passionately that when the time is right for Mac and Charlie to have a connection, when and if it's safe for them to do so, to have a connection with their genetic identity is really, really important. I'm not scared of that, Si. You know, a lot of families that I speak to, you know, there's a fear, and I listen, I get it, and I understand it, that, you know, when children are adopted, you have this sort of almost... It's a trap we can fall into as adopters, where you sort of feel as though I just want to shut the door now and just sort of keep it all to ourselves and just make this sort of forever family thing just feel very safe and sanitized. And the reality is that children in the care system, and those even who go on to be adopted, there's nothing sanitized about adoption. You know, by itself and on itself, it's a trauma. For any child to get to a place whereby they need to have another family to live with other than their own biological family means that something's gone really wrong, right?
Yeah.
And therefore, I have a responsibility as the adoptive mum not to shy away from what is their pain, not to shy away from that story, but rather to embrace it and find a way whereby Mac and Charlie don't romanticize, Si, what their biological family might look like, but rather, as I've done from day dot, before they were verbal, and vocal, I've been able to share with them about their story. So they've never not known they were adopted. I talk to them regularly, what's called about their life story. And when the time is right, I will find the right way with the right agencies involved, where we will have a constructive connection back again to biological family. Because by the time they're 18 plus, Si, what's better, that I do this well and appropriately with them, or they go off and do it on their own and it may not be, you know, what they expect or want it to be.
Yeah.
And that's a real learning journey for any adopter, is how do we do that with the children at the heart of it, as opposed to our own heart needing to be protected from it. The children have got to come first. And so Mac and Charlie are now 10 and 11. They arrived with me when they were 7 days old and 13 months, respectively. And both little lads were, little Charlie was withdrawing and he had head tremors and he struggled with eye contact for the first wee while. And one social worker thought immediately, it's on his notes where it writes ?autism. But actually, interestingly, Charlie, the little one, he's, whilst a very small little lad for his age and for his chronological age because of his womb experience, he's doing well. He's academically holding his own. But Mac, bless him, has a few more challenges, and he's now 11, and he has a condition called fetal alcohol syndrome, which is where his womb was cognitively impacted due to an excess of alcohol. And so it's had a lifelong impact on Mac's brain and developmental capacity. And so he's about 5 years delayed in terms of his thinking and learning. So I have an 11-year-old, but it really feels like a 6-year-old. And his learning is lifelong impacted now, Si. So Mac has what's called moderate learning disabilities. And I'm currently in the throes of a huge tribunal where I'm having to sadly take the local authority to court in order to get them to provide Mac with the right specialist placement for his secondary experience. They've nominated a school that is totally inappropriate for him. And so the fight for an adoptive mum does not stop. And obviously I also run an organisation where I try and fight for children to be found the best of the best homes and find people to meet the needs of children. And so I'm on a busman's holiday, really. So I live and breathe what I do in my day, and I live and breathe in my day what I do in my evening. And I just figure that, you know what, there's an integrity to that as well. And I would have it no other way.
Give us some of the stats of the situation in the UK.
So presently, year on year, about 100,000 children and young people needing a home outside of their biological family. And the stats just keep growing, which is a really sad thing to say. COVID really didn't help for all the obvious reasons, that where there was already fault lines within families, where there were struggles, what we call the sort of toxic trio: poverty, domestic violence and addiction, oftentimes then conflate, when those are happening together, but also then when children were around 24/7. You can imagine that if there were fault lines already, then that just produced even more pressure on families that were feeling overwhelmed or isolated. And so it's just resulted in more and more children into the care system. And there are not enough foster carers, Si. There's just not enough. I mean, it's a fact. It's a stat. Bernardo's called it a national emergency. And it continues to be that, in that local authorities are having to place children in inappropriate accommodation. We've got teenagers entering the care system in greater numbers than we ever have before. 1 in 4 entering the care system for the first time are teenagers, 13 and above. And we've got stories and evidence stories of young people being placed in caravans and tents and canal boats in order to simply put something over their heads, which might be called a roof, because there's just not enough respite and or foster care within the United Kingdom. And so Home for Good looks to the church and says there's 50,000 churches in the United Kingdom. 50,000. And in my reckoning, Si, that means that even if one person, couple or family in every church in this country said, look, would you, the church, support me if I opened up my home? Well, then we would be the solution to the tune of a half of caring for all those young people. And then obviously if every church looked to support, love and care for an individual couple or family to open up their home, and that happened twice within every church, we would eradicate the need for the care system. And that, to me, Si, feels like eminently possible.
Because the local church is the hope of the world. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, well, I mean, I'm involved at the next stage, which is, so in the last year, 2 years maybe, our local church, which isn't a big church, St. Andrew's on Fox Hill. We've bought 2 houses. And we've got 4 young ladies who've come out of the care system. I think most of them are 18-year-old, maybe one's a bit older. And that's with Hope into Action. Ed Walker actually was the first podcast we did. And he's looking at the next level up, isn't it? The local church is the hope of the world. 50,000 churches. You're talking, if they do what if we got behind one person in our church to foster, that's half the problem solved. Two couples doing it, that would be the whole problem solved. That's so eminently doable, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. It really is. And Ed and I have developed just a wonderful relationship over these last couple of years. And so we are seeking to see, not only can we care for children in the care system, but as you say, just as you've expressed, you've got 4 care leaving people who are care experienced, who, because of what they will have gone through, have got some needs that people just won't be aware of, like even just things like budgeting or understanding the faithfulness of friendship and family will be something they may not have experienced. And so for us as the church to be able to get around not only those who are needing care and a home, but those who are care leaving is really, really important. And so it's been a joy to get to know Ed. And so it's wonderful to hear that your church is already working with Hope into Action. Just brilliant, Si.
Give us a sort of your biblical go-to verses and theology for that, what you're doing.
Well, funnily enough, I always just go to Psalm 68, 6 onwards, and it talks about God placing the lonely in families. And most people will always assume, Si, that I go to the whole kind of sort of Romans, Abba Father, we were adopted and therefore, we should follow similarly. Actually, I don't think adoption is for everybody. And actually, I don't think that it is something that, everybody is at that point in their life gifted to do. But I tell you what, everybody can be placed in family, because let's define family. So for me, the whole family is what I expressed a little bit earlier about my community and my church. That is my family. I call them my family of choice. And God places the lonely in families. But do you know who I also call the lonely one? Well, that's me. So instead of us having this rescue narrative that says, oh, bless Mac and Charlie, they were placed with me and therefore the lonely were placed in a family, I reverse that. God knew how lonely I was and how much I had a deep desire to want to care for children, be loved and love in return. And so actually my loneliness was also addressed, and therefore me, Mac and Charlie became family. And God then placed us together in another family. God is a family making God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He then had this beautiful and weird idea to have Jesus born from a single mother who then was adopted by Joseph, who had no bloodline relation to Jesus whatsoever. So Jesus was brought up by a fella who was by God placed as Jesus's family. So this for me is the whole thing about what we as church are. We are a family making family. And so Charlie and Mac and me, we've been placed together as family who together have been placed in a wider family who make up God's family. And that is what the church was meant for. It's to hold each other together well. It's not about DNA, Si. It's not about bloodline. It's all about who we are placed with in order to fully express God to and through each other.
Hi folks, I'd love you to check out chooselife.org.uk, and there you can sign up for a weekly vlog that I'll be coming out with through the coming year. Journey with us. And also there you can buy the book if you haven't got it yet, Choose Life, 365 readings for radical disciples. So why don't you join us on that journey? chooselife.org.uk. Now let's get back to the podcast. So what would you love to see come out of this podcast? I mean, there's obviously a bigger vision, but, how can we help?
First and foremost, when we know how much we are loved by Father God, when we know and appreciate that there's nothing out of reach for him, there's nothing that he will reject us on the basis of, and when that love is evident in our own hearts, then it just means our capacity to love grows and changes. And that's really what I was inferring to earlier, Si, when I said it's taken me a long time to shed the shame and pain of what I did wrong and not really understanding myself and not understanding how I could interact well with people that would leave everyone safe and happy. And it's taken me this long to understand that I am just an adored daughter of the Most High, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And it's because of that I can parent Mac and Charlie in a way that shows a radical love. And it means I can receive love in a way that means that I can then be loved in order to keep giving love. And if that's the one thing I would want to have people hear is that when we are in that relationship with God, our the tent pegs of our lives, and it talks, doesn't it, in scripture about enlarge your tent pegs, because from there you have no idea quite how glorious the adventure can be. Allow me to place the invitation out to people to feel the love of God, to be embraced with the love of God, in order that our tent pegs of our hearts be enlarged to such an extent where we can embrace the pain of others and bring people into our lives, and them bring us into our lives as image bearers of Christ, which means that we can care for each other, care for children who need a home, who need love, stability and safety. And likewise, we too would allow ourselves to be placed in a family of choice whereby we can reach our fullest potential. And so are there people listening to this who think, do you know what? I can taste that the tent pegs have been stretched in my life, and I've got room in my heart and home to be able to care for a child in the care system. I've got room here. I've got room in my heart because of how I'm loved, that I can care for a child and help them reach their fullest potential. Then we would love to talk to them, Si. I guess that's how this might best help Home for Good find a home for every child who needs one.
So that's homeforgood.org.uk. Do check that out, and think of someone else. I mean, forwarding this podcast to someone else you think they would be brilliant at it.
Yeah.
Because as Tarn says, it's not for everyone, but together as team,
that's it.
We can do this, can't we?
Yeah.
Is there anything that we've missed out that you'd want to share?
Actually, Si, genuinely no. I just feel that I've expressed everything I thought I would want to.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, listen, folks, it's meaty. It's a heavy topic. It's not a soft sell. So no. I wouldn't mind just you addressing that before we close, because it's a huge deal, isn't it?
Yeah. So, Si, I think one of the things I would also want to share is that, it takes a village, as we well know, that classic African proverb. It takes a village to raise a child. And it's so much so is true for us caring for children who are living with the legacy of trauma. Because there is a lot of pain and there is a lot of challenge when caring for a child from the care system because of what they will be living with. As I've shared about Mac and Charlie, there's all sorts of different diagnoses that they have as a result of their early years, ADHD and learning disabilities, and also just the psychological impact of them navigating adoption and not being with their biological family. So I think it's a really important thing that we share that this does take a village. I've got speech therapists in my immediate community. I've got counsellors. I've got those who are just willing to sit and listen. I've got those who are really great just taking the boys out to do an afternoon if behaviours are getting a bit challenging and go and kick a ball. It's really important that we acknowledge that this is not about a rescue. This is not about taking a child in and everyone will feel better about the whole thing and the child's behaviours will suddenly become linear and obvious and behaviourally aligned with your family construct, because that's just not the reality. It's actually a much needed thing that people are aware that to go on our own growth journey when caring for traumatized children is vital. Then that means that those who feel as though there's room in their heart and home, it's those types of people with that kind of thinking that means that we will be able to provide homes that can last the course. It's just really important to share that side, to manage expectations.
Yeah. Well, I love it that that wild child, young Tarn, who was very lost and very, heading to destruction and carnage, that the Lord has, by His grace, harnessed the energy and zeal and the sense of righteous indignation at injustice to be part of a beautiful story in your own individual context and leading a whole movement. I know you got groups, you got offices across the country, a great staff team, all pulling in the same direction, lots of volunteers. And guys, you could be involved in that. If it's stirring your heart, go please to homeforgood.org.uk and pray with your spouse if you're married, or just with mates, and think, how can we make a difference in this area? Tarn, it's been brilliant to have you. Thank you for being fun and deep and the whole gamut of emotions I've experienced in between. God bless you loads.
You're amazing, Si. Bless you too.
Yeah. Oh, what a treat to have you. Listen, folks, forward this to someone who needs to hear it. How you can help us, you can give us a top quality review on Spotify, iTunes. Just means the algorithm will get this in front of more people so that more people can be impacted and stirred and challenged and inspired. That'd be great. I want to thank Adam Thomas Steer for the editing and Mike Sandeman for the mixing. Next week, we've got another fantastic guest. So I love all these different conversations. They're awesome, aren't they? So join us again next week. In the meantime, have a good week. God bless, and toodaloo.